The forest was alive with a quiet kind of magic, the kind that settled over the world as twilight began to descend. Ethan steered the old truck carefully up the winding dirt road, the trees crowding closer as they climbed higher into the hills. Beside him, Zara sat with Rex's head resting on her lap, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the dog's soft ears. The silence between them was companionable, filled not with the weight of unspoken words but with the comfort of being together. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent hummed a feeling neither of them could name but both felt. The cabin came into view at last, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. It was rustic, almost forgotten looking, with weathered wood and a stone chimney that leaned slightly to one side. But there was a charm to it, a sense of permanence that seemed to belong more to the earth itself than to the people who had built it. Ethan killed the engine and exhaled, his hands lingering on the steering wheel as he took in the sight. "Looks like it hasn't changed much," he said, his voice low and reflective. Zara glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "You say that like you've been here before." He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Feels like I have," he admitted after a moment. "Weird, huh?" Zara's smile softened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she opened the truck door, stepping out into the cool, pine-scented air. Rex followed immediately, his tail wagging as he sniffed the ground, exploring this new and unfamiliar place. Ethan joined them, grabbing their bags from the back of the truck and pausing to take in the cabin again. There was something about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, that made his chest tighten. The inside of the cabin was as simple and unassuming as the outside. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, its hearth stacked with wood that looked like it had been cut decades ago. A threadbare rug lay sprawled across the hardwood floor, and a single bookshelf stood against the far wall, its shelves crammed with mismatched volumes. The air smelled faintly of cedar and something older, something earthy and familiar. As Zara wandered into the kitchen, Ethan set their bags down and let his gaze wander. His eyes caught on a small table near the fireplace, where a dusty pocket watch lay abandoned, as though someone had just stepped out and forgotten it. He reached for it without thinking, his fingers brushing the cool metal. A strange sensation washed over him, an ache, deep and unnameable, as though the object itself carried a fragment of something he'd lost. Zara's voice brought him back to the present, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her head tilted slightly as she studied him. "You okay?" He nodded, slipping the watch into his pocket before he even realized what he was doing. "Yeah," he said quickly. This place feels odd. Like déjà vu on steroids." Zara stepped closer, her arms crossed over her chest. "You're not the only one," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I feel it too. Like we've been here before, even though I know we haven't." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade. Ethan opened his mouth to say something he didn't know what, but Rex's sudden bark cut through the silence, startling them both. The dog was at the far side of the room, his nose pressed against a door that led to what looked like a storage closet. His tail wagged furiously as he pawed at the wood. "Looks like Rex found something," Zara said, her brow furrowing as she moved to the door. She opened it slowly, revealing a small, dusty space lined with shelves. On one of the shelves sat an old wooden box, its surface scratched and weathered with age. Zara hesitated, then reached for it, her fingers brushing the lid. Ethan joined her, his curiosity piqued. "What do you think's inside?" he asked. "Only one way to find out," Zara replied, lifting the lid. Inside were several items: a faded photograph, a delicate locket, and a folded piece of parchment that looked like it had been sitting there for centuries. Zara picked up the locket first, her breath catching as she opened it to reveal a tiny portrait of a woman who looked startlingly like her. "That's strange," she murmured, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it up for Ethan to see. "That's more than strange," he said, his voice low. "That's uncanny." Before they could process it further, Rex barked again, nudging the photograph with his nose. Zara set the locket down and picked up the picture, brushing away the dust to reveal an image of a man and a woman standing in front of a cabin that looked exactly like the one they were in. The woman wore a dress that could have been from the 19th century, her hair pinned back in a way that seemed both elegant and familiar. The man stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, his face so similar to Ethan's that it made Zara's heart skip a beat. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I see it," he said, his tone flat but his eyes wide with disbelief. He reached for the parchment, unfolding it carefully. The ink was faded but legible, written in a hand that felt almost familiar. The words sent a chill down his spine. "To whoever finds this, know that love is a thread that cannot be broken, no matter the weight of time or distance. We have lived, and we have loved, and we will do so again. Eternity is ours to share. Zara looked up at him, her eyes wide, the photograph still clutched in her hand. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Ethan said, though the answer felt like it was on the tip of his tongue, just out of reach. "But I think this isn't the first time we've been here. Or together." They stood in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them like a heavy blanket. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across their faces. Rex, sensing the tension, sat at their feet, his warm presence grounding them in the moment. "I think we need to figure this out," Zara said finally, her voice steadier now. She set the photograph and locked it back in the box, closing the lid with a sense of finality. "Whatever this is, it's part of us. We can't ignore it." Ethan nodded, his hand slipping into his pocket to touch the pocket watch. The metal felt warm against his skin, almost alive. "Yeah," he said, "we're not going anywhere until we get some answers." And so, as the night deepened and the forest outside whispered secrets to the stars, Ethan, Zara, and Rex prepared to uncover the truth hidden within the cabin's walls and within themselves. The pull of the past was undeniable, and as they faced the mysteries ahead, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The cabin seemed alive with whispers of the past, its walls exhaling stories that had been trapped for decades, maybe centuries. The air inside had shifted since Ethan and Zara uncovered the first set of relics, a locket that bore Zara's likeness, a pocket watch that seemed to pulse with familiarity in Ethan's hand, and the haunting photograph of two people who looked too much like them to be a coincidence. Every corner of the cabin felt heavy with untold truths, as though it had been waiting for their arrival to unlock its secrets. The morning light streamed through the windows, painting the room in soft gold, but neither Ethan nor Zara could shake the chill that lingered from the night before. Rex was curled on the rug by the fireplace, his sharp ears twitching occasionally as if listening to something only he could hear. Ethan sat at the small wooden table, the pocket watch resting in front of him, its intricate design catching the light. Zara stood nearby, turning the locket over in her fingers, her brow furrowed in deep thought. "I can't stop thinking about it," she said finally, her voice breaking the silence. "The resemblance, the writing in that note. It's like this place is trying to tell us something, but I don't know what." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the watch. "It feels bigger than us," he admitted. "Like we're part of something we can't quite see yet. But it's there, waiting." Zara moved to the bookshelf, her fingers trailing over the spines of old, weathered books. Many of the titles were in languages she didn't recognize, but one stood out, a slim, leather-bound journal with no markings on the cover. She pulled it free, the leather cool against her palms, and opened it to find pages filled with delicate handwriting. The ink had faded in places, but it was legible enough. "What is it?" Ethan asked, noticing her stillness. "A journal," Zara replied, her voice soft with wonder. She sat down beside him, opening the book to its first page. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and the words sent a shiver down her spine. "To my love, if you find this, know that I always believed we would meet again." Ethan's breath caught as he leaned closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Keep reading," he urged. Zara turned the pages carefully, the weight of the journal heavier than its physical form. The entries chronicled a love story that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. A man and a woman, deeply in love, who had come to the cabin seeking refuge from a world that didn't understand their bond. Their names, Elias and Myron, were different, but the way they spoke to each other in the journal felt startlingly like the conversations Ethan and Zara had shared. "It's US," Zara whispered, her voice trembling. "Or, it's who we were." Ethan's jaw tightened as he scanned the pages. "And something happened to them," he said, pointing to a passage where the handwriting became more frantic. The words spoke of a betrayal, a loss that neither Elias nor Myron could prevent, and a vow to find each other again no matter how many lifetimes it took. The room seemed to grow colder as they read, the fire in the hearth flickering as though caught in a sudden draft. Rex lifted his head, his ears perking up as a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan and Zara exchanged a glance, their unease deepening. "This place is more than just a cabin," Ethan said, standing abruptly. He moved to the hearth, where the fire's embers glowed faintly. It's holding pieces of us. Pieces of them." Zara closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. "If this is true," she said, her voice low, "then we're part of something that's been happening for lifetimes. But why now? Why here?" Before Ethan could respond, Rex stood and padded toward the far wall, his nose pressed to the floorboards. He whined softly, pawing at the wood until Ethan moved to investigate. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, crouching down. The dog's tail wagged faintly, his eyes bright with urgency. Ethan rapped his knuckles against the floor and froze when he heard a hollow sound. There's something under here, he said, his voice sharp with curiosity. He grabbed a nearby fire poker and pried at the boards until they gave way, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a box, much like the one they had found the night before, but larger and more ornate. Ethan lifted it out carefully, setting it on the table as Zara joined him. The box was carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shimmer in the light, and the lock had long since rusted away. With a glance at Zara, Ethan opened it. The contents were a strange mix, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small vial of amber liquid, and a silver key. But what caught their attention most was a folded map, its edges brittle with age. Ethan unfolded it slowly, revealing a detailed drawing of the forest surrounding the cabin. Several landmarks were marked, some familiar, others entirely unknown. This looks like a trail, Zara said, tracing her finger along the map. But it leads somewhere off the main paths. Look, here she pointed to a symbol near the edge of the map, a swirling pattern that matched the carvings on the box. It's like they left us a guide, Ethan said, his voice hushed. He glanced at the letters. And these, maybe they'll tell us more about what happened, about what we're supposed to do. Zara nodded, though her gaze was distant, her mind spinning with possibilities. It's like they knew we'd find this, she murmured. Like they knew we'd come back. Ethan touched her arm gently, drawing her eyes to his. We'll figure it out, he said firmly. Together. The determination in his voice steadied her, and she nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. They spent the rest of the day poring over the letters, which told fragments of a story that mirrored their own. Elias and Miran had been drawn to the cabin by dreams and memories they couldn't explain, and their time there had unlocked truths about themselves and the bond they shared that defied logic. But the letters ended abruptly, leaving their fate a mystery. The last note was unfinished, the ink smudged as though written in haste. Zara read it aloud, her voice trembling. The forest is calling. We must go. If we don't return, let this be proof that love is stronger than time. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze moving to the map. Then that's where we'll go, he said. If they found answers out there, maybe we will too. Zara hesitated, her hand brushing over the locket she had placed around her neck. What if we're not ready for what we find, she asked softly. Ethan turned to her, his expression gentle but resolute. We're already part of this, he said, and whatever we find, we'll face it together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the cabin, Ethan and Zara prepared to follow the trail marked on the map. The secrets of the cabin had awakened something within them, something powerful, eternal, and unyielding. And though fear lingered at the edges of their thoughts, their bond burned brighter, guiding them toward the truth waiting in the depths of the forest. The forest was darker than Ethan or Zara had anticipated. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like skeletal arms. The map, though detailed, was difficult to follow in the thick undergrowth, and the trails it marked seemed almost deliberately obscured, as though time itself had conspired to erase their path. Ethan held a flashlight in one hand and the map in the other, the faint beam of light cutting through the shadows. Zara followed close behind, her hand resting on Rex's head for reassurance. The dog moved confidently, as though he knew where they were going even when they didn't. This can't just be coincidence, Zara murmured, her voice hushed. Her breath fogged in the crisp evening air. The letters, the map, the cabin. It's like everything is leading us here. Ethan glanced back at her, his face illuminated briefly by the flashlight's beam. It's more than that, he said. It's like we're retracing their steps. Elias and Miran must have walked this same path. Zara nodded, her fingers brushing the locket around her neck. Do you think they found what they were looking for, she asked. Ethan hesitated, his brow furrowing. I don't know, he admitted, but I think we're about to find out. They pressed on, the forest growing denser with each step. Rex led the way, his ears perked, his nose to the ground. Occasionally he would pause, sniffing the air before letting out a low whine and continuing forward. It was as if he sensed something just out of reach. Zara tightened her grip on his collar, her heart pounding in her chest. The air felt heavier here, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The first landmark from the map appeared suddenly, emerging from the shadows like a ghostly sentinel. It was a stone archway, its surface weathered and moss-covered, standing alone in a clearing. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, their shapes fluid and intricate, glowing faintly in the dark. Ethan ran his fingers over the carvings, a shiver running through him as the symbols seemed to hum beneath his touch. These match the patterns on the box, he said, glancing at Zara. It's all connected. Zara crouched beside him, her hand brushing against the base of the archway. The earth felt warm, pulsing faintly beneath her palm. This isn't just stone, she said, her voice trembling. It's alive, or something close to it. Rex let out a sharp bark, drawing their attention to a narrow path on the other side of the archway. It was barely visible, overgrown with vines and brambles, but it was unmistakably the next step on the map. Ethan and Zara exchanged a glance before following Rex through the archway, their movements careful, almost reverent. As they walked, the forest seemed to change around them. The air grew warmer, the shadows deeper, and the sounds of the night crickets, rustling leaves faded into an almost unnatural silence. The path twisted and turned, leading them deeper into a part of the woods that felt untouched by time. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the silence broke. It started as a faint hum, barely audible, but it grew louder with each step. The sound was low and resonant, vibrating in their bones. Rex's ears flattened, his tail wagging uncertainly as he pressed closer to Zara. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "It's coming from up ahead." They emerged into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive stone structure that seemed to rise organically from the ground. It was circular, almost altar-like, with the same glowing symbols carved into its surface. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it rested an object that seemed to pulse with light, a crystalline orb, its surface swirling with colors that shifted and danced like liquid fire. Zara took a step forward, her breath catching. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan approached cautiously, the flashlight forgotten in his hand. It looks like he trailed off, unable to find the words. The orb was mesmerizing, its light reflecting in his eyes. He reached out instinctively, but Zara grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp. "We don't know what it is. What if it's dangerous?" Ethan hesitated, her words breaking through the spell the orb seemed to cast. "You're right," he said, stepping back. "But this has to be what Elias and Myron were looking for. It's the end of the map." Zara nodded, her gaze fixed on the orb. "And maybe it's the answer to everything." As if in response to her words, the orb flared brighter, its light spilling across the clearing. The hum grew louder, resonating in their chests, and the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. Rex barked, a sharp, urgent sound, but before Ethan or Zara could react, the light enveloped them completely. When the light faded, they were no longer in the clearing. Ethan and Zara stood in a vast, endless expanse of white, the boundaries of reality dissolving into nothingness. The orb floated before them, its glow softer now, almost inviting. "What is this place?" Zara asked, her voice trembling. Her hand clutched Ethan's tightly, her nails digging into his skin. Ethan shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know," he said. "But I think it's showing us something." The orb began to pulse rhythmically, and suddenly images filled the space around them, fragments of memories that weren't their own. They saw Elias and Myron, their faces etched with love and determination, standing before the same altar. They saw other versions of themselves in different eras and different places, their lives intertwined in ways that defied logic. It was overwhelming, a kaleidoscope of emotions and experiences that flooded their senses. They saw joy and laughter, heartbreak and sacrifice, moments of triumph and devastating loss. Each life was a thread in an intricate tapestry, weaving them together through time and space. Zara's knees buckled, and Ethan caught her, his own breath ragged as he tried to make sense of it all. "This is us," he said, his voice hoarse. "These are our lives, every time, every place. We've always found each other." Zara looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "But why?" she asked. "Why does this keep happening?" The orb pulsed again, and a final image appeared before them, Elias and Myron, standing in the forest, their hands clasped tightly as they looked toward the horizon. Myron's voice echoed softly, her words clear despite the distance of time. "Because love is eternal, and we are bound by it no matter the cost." The image faded, and the orb dimmed, its light fading into the endless white. Ethan and Zara were left alone, their hearts pounding with the weight of what they had seen. "This is why we're here," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "Not just to remember, but to finish what they started." Zara nodded, her grip on his hand tightening. "Then let's finish it," she said. "Together." As the light around them began to shift, pulling them back to the forest, they knew they had crossed a threshold. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. Their love was eternal, boundless, and unyielding. And now it was up to them to honor it, to embrace the destiny that had brought them here, and the lives that had led them to this moment. The forest was darker now, the thick canopy above blotting out the last traces of sunlight. Ethan and Zara moved in near silence, their footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth. Rex padded close to Zara's side, his tail low, his ears twitching at every faint sound. The weight of what they'd seen in the vision, lifetimes of love, loss, and sacrifice pressed down on them, unspoken but palpable. Ethan led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but his mind was elsewhere. The images from the orb replayed in his head like a relentless tide, dragging him back into moments that felt both foreign and familiar. He saw himself, other versions of himself, holding Zara, losing her, fighting for her, and sometimes failing. Every life they had shared was marked by love, yes, but also by pain. Why didn't they tell us it would be like this? Zara's voice broke the silence, soft but sharp. She stopped walking, forcing Ethan to turn and face her. The flashlight illuminated her features, and he saw the storm in her eyes. Why didn't Elias and Mirren warn us about how much it would hurt? Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. Maybe they didn't know how, he said quietly. Maybe they thought we'd figure it out ourselves. Figure out what? Zara snapped, her voice rising. That we're trapped? That no matter what we do, we're doomed to repeat the same cycle over and over again? Love, loss, pain. How is that fair? Rex whined softly, pressing his head against Zara's leg as though trying to comfort her. Ethan took a step closer, his own frustration simmering beneath the surface. You think I don't feel it too, he said, his voice taut. You think I don't hate that every time we get close to something good, it gets ripped away? Zara's jaw tightened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then why do we keep going, she demanded. Why do we keep doing this if it always ends the same way? Because it's worth it, Ethan shot back, his voice echoing through the trees. His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and for a moment, the only sound was their ragged breathing. Zara stared at him, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. Worth it, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan, we don't even remember half of it. All those lives, all those moments, they're just fragments. Pieces of something we can't put back together. How can you be so sure it's worth it? Ethan hesitated, the fire in his chest dimming as he searched for the right words. Because he said finally, his voice softening. Because every time, no matter what, we find each other. Even when everything else falls apart, even when we lose everything, we find each other. That has to mean something. Zara looked away, her arms wrapping around herself as though trying to hold herself together. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this, she admitted, her voice barely audible. I thought I was, but it's too much. Ethan stepped closer, his flashlight discarded on the ground as he reached for her. His hands settled on her shoulders, firm but gentle, grounding her in the moment. You're stronger than you think, he said, his voice steady. You always have been. Zara met his gaze, her eyes searching his for answers he didn't have. The space between them felt charged, not just with the weight of their shared history but with the unspoken emotions that had been building since they first set foot in the cabin. Ethan's hands slid down her arms, his touch warm and reassuring, and she let out a shaky breath. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice cracking. What if we can't break the cycle? What if we're just stuck? Ethan shook his head, his hands tightening slightly on hers. We're not stuck, he said firmly. We've made it this far, haven't we? We've survived things we didn't even remember until now. That has to mean we're capable of more. Zara looked at him, the flicker of doubt in her eyes beginning to fade. You really believe that, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I do, Ethan said, his gaze unwavering. Because I believe in us. The words hung in the air between them, a quiet but powerful declaration. Zara's shoulders relaxed and she took a step closer, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. Ethan, she said softly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that broke something inside him. I'm here, he said, his voice steady. I've always been here. She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his as her breath mingled with his. For a moment, the forest around them seemed to fade, the weight of their past lives dissolving into the present. There was only this moment, this connection, this love that had endured across lifetimes. When Zara finally pulled back, her eyes were brighter, her resolve stronger. If we're going to do this, she said, her voice steady now, then we do it together. No more running, no more hiding. Ethan smiled faintly, his hand brushing a strand of hair from her face. Together, he agreed. Rex barked softly, drawing their attention back to the path ahead. The dog wagged his tail, his bright eyes fixed on something just beyond the trees. Ethan and Zara exchanged a glance before following him, their steps more certain now. As they walked, the pain of rediscovery still lingered, but it no longer felt insurmountable. They had faced the truth of their past, every heartbreak, every sacrifice, and had chosen to move forward. Together, they would find the answers they sought, no matter what lay ahead. And for the first time, the darkness of the forest didn't feel so overwhelming. It felt like possibility. The cabin stood silent and still, shrouded in the pale glow of the moonlight filtering through the forest canopy. Ethan and Zara were back where they had started, but everything had changed. The map, the journal, the visions all had brought them here, to this moment of reckoning. The air inside the cabin felt different now, heavier, charged with an energy that crackled just beneath the surface. Even Rex, normally so alert, lay quietly by the hearth, his bright eyes fixed on the center of the room as though waiting for something to happen. Ethan paced near the fireplace, the silver key from the hidden box clutched tightly in his hand. Its weight felt disproportionate, as if it carried more than its small frame should. Zara sat at the table, the locket around her neck catching the light as she turned the faded map over and over, searching for anything they might have missed. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "The key, the map, the symbols. It's all been leading us here." Zara looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "But leading us to what?" she asked. "We've uncovered so much, but it still feels like we're standing on the edge of something we can't see, something we don't understand." Ethan stopped pacing, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice steady. "We've come too far to stop now." Zara sighed, her fingers brushing the locket. "What if the answer is something we don't want to face?" she asked quietly. "What if it's something we can't come back from?" Ethan moved closer, kneeling in front of her and taking her hands in his. His touch was warm, grounding, and she felt some of her fear ease. "We've faced everything else together," he said. "Whatever this is, we'll face it too. I'm not going anywhere." Zara nodded, her grip tightening on his hands. "Neither am I." Their moment was interrupted by a sudden shift in the air. The room seemed to tremble, the faint glow from the fireplace flickering erratically. Rex stood abruptly, his ears perked and a low growl rumbling in his chest. Ethan and Zara exchanged a glance before turning their attention to the center of the room. The symbols on the floor, faint and nearly invisible until now, began to glow softly, their light pulsing in time with an unseen rhythm. The key in Ethan's hand grew warm, and he felt an almost magnetic pull toward the center of the cabin. "It's happening," Zara whispered, rising to her feet. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding as he stepped toward the glowing symbols. He knelt, fitting the key into a nearly imperceptible slot in the center of the floor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the symbols flared to life, their light spilling across the room and illuminating everything in an otherworldly glow. A low hum filled the air, growing louder and more resonant until it seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The center of the floor began to shift, the wood and stone giving way to reveal a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Cold air wafted up from the depths, carrying with it a scent that was both earthy and metallic. Zara took a step back, her breath hitching. "Ethan, what is this?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He stared into the dark abyss, his pulse racing. "It's what we've been looking for," he said finally. The end of the trail. They descended the staircase slowly, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint glow of the symbols above was replaced by a soft, bluish light emanating from somewhere below. Rex followed close behind, his movements cautious but steady. The staircase ended in a vast underground chamber, its walls carved with intricate patterns that shimmered faintly in the dim light. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a glowing orb similar to the one they had seen in the forest. But this orb was larger, its light more intense, and it pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost alive. "This is it," Zara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is what they found." Ethan approached the pedestal cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The orb's light seemed to draw him in, its glow both beautiful and unnerving. As he reached out to touch it, a voice echoed through the chamber, not spoken aloud, but resonating directly in their minds. "You have come seeking answers. But answers come with a cost." Zara gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The voice did not respond. Instead, the orb flared brighter and the chamber around them seemed to dissolve. Ethan and Zara found themselves standing in a different place, an open field under a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. The air was warm, the grass beneath their feet soft, and the faint hum of the orb was replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind. Before them stood two figures, Elias and Myron. They were as they had appeared in the visions, Elias tall and broad-shouldered, his features strikingly similar to Ethan's, and Myron radiant, her eyes mirroring Zara's in their intensity. They looked at Ethan and Zara with a mixture of sadness and hope. "You are U.S. Myron said, her voice melodic and filled with emotion. "And we are you." Ethan took a step forward, his hands trembling. "Why did you bring us here?" he asked. "What do you want from us?" "This is not about one," Elias said, his tone steady but heavy with sorrow. This is about what must be done. The cycles we have endured, the lives we have lived, they all lead to this moment. Zara stepped closer to Ethan, her hand slipping into his. What moment, she asked, her voice shaking. What are you asking us to do? Mirren stepped forward, her gaze soft but resolute. To break the cycle, one must sacrifice. The bond that ties you through time and space is both your strength and your burden. To sever it is to end the cycle, to free you, and all who come after. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. You're saying one of us has to? Yes, Elias interrupted, his expression grim. One must let go, fully, completely, so the other may carry the light forward. The weight of their words hit like a physical blow. Zara turned to Ethan, tears welling in her eyes. We can't, she said, her voice breaking. We can't do this. There has to be another way. There isn't, Ethan said, his throat tight. He looked at her, his heart breaking. But if it means you'll be free, if it means you'll live, then I'll do it. I'll let go. No, Zara shouted, gripping his arms tightly. You can't. I won't let you. Elias and Mirren stepped closer, their forms shimmering like reflections on water. This choice can only be made together, Myron said softly. And only if your love is strong enough to endure it. Ethan cupped Zara's face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I love you, he said, his voice trembling. I've always loved you. And I'd do it all again every lifetime, every moment just to find you. Zara sobbed, her hands clutching his. And I'd do the same, she whispered. But I can't lose you, Ethan. Not again. You won't, he said, his voice breaking. You'll carry me with you. Always. The orb flared again, its light surrounding them. Zara clung to Ethan as the warmth of the light engulfed them, and in that moment she felt his love more deeply than ever before. It was an unbreakable thread, binding them through time and space. And then, just as suddenly, the light was gone. Zara stood alone in the chamber, the orb dark and still. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around, her heart aching with the weight of Ethan's absence. But she felt him still, a quiet presence within her, a love that transcended time, stronger than any sacrifice. And she knew, deep in her soul, that he was with her. Always. The cabin was quiet, bathed in the soft golden glow of the morning sun that spilled through the wide windows. The air was still, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees outside. Zara sat on the worn rug in front of the fireplace, her legs crossed, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands. Rex lay stretched out beside her, his chest rising and falling steadily as he dozed. The weight of the recent days still lingered, a quiet ache in her chest, but it no longer felt unbearable. It was no longer sharp. Instead, it had softened, transforming into something bittersweet, a reminder of everything she and Ethan had endured. Her fingers brushed the delicate silver locket resting against her collarbone. The faint warmth of it was soothing, as though it carried a spark of Ethan's presence. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly, and for a moment she swore she could hear his voice, feel his hand in hers, grounding her. It was fleeting but real, a reminder that their bond had not been severed entirely, even if he was no longer beside her. The sound of paw steps on the creaky floorboards made her open her eyes. Rex had woken, his tail thumping gently against the floor as he nudged her with his nose. Zara smiled, setting her mug down to scratch behind his ears. Good morning, boy, she murmured. Still watching over me, huh? Rex barked softly, as if in agreement, and Zara felt a pang of gratitude for his steadfast presence. The dog had been her anchor in the days since Ethan's sacrifice, a constant reminder of the love and loyalty they had shared as a family. She had stayed in the cabin not out of obligation, but because it felt right. This place filled with memories, secrets, and echoes of their shared past was where she needed to be. The cabin was no longer just a relic of their journey. It had become a sanctuary, a space where she could begin to heal and honor the promises she and Ethan had made to each other. She had started making small changes, breathing new life into the old, worn-down structure. The firewood was freshly chopped, the hearth swept clean. The bookshelves, once coated in dust, now gleamed with a careful polish, their spines neatly arranged. And though the changes were small, each one felt like a step towards something whole, something new. As the morning sunlight shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, Zara stood and stretched, letting the warmth of the sun soak into her skin. She walked to the kitchen, her bare feet cool against the wooden floor, and began preparing breakfast. The rhythmic motions of chopping vegetables and stirring a pot were soothing, a reminder of the simple joys of living. The scent of herbs and spices filled the air, and she felt a flicker of peace settling into her chest. Rex barked again, this time louder, his ears pricking toward the front door. Zara frowned, wiping her hands on a towel as she moved to see what had caught his attention. The dog stood at the door, his tail wagging furiously, his nose pressed against the crack. Zara hesitated for a moment before opening it. The forest outside was alive with light and sound, birds chirping in the branches above, the breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth. There was no one there, no movement except the rustling leaves. But as Zara stepped outside, she felt a presence, familiar and comforting, like the warmth of a hand brushing hers. Her breath caught and she closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She wasn't sure if it was real or imagined, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She felt him, not as a ghost or memory, but as a quiet, steady presence that lived within her. He was there, not in the flesh, but in the essence of everything around her, the light filtering through the trees, the rustle of the wind, the soft hum of the earth beneath her feet. Her hand moved instinctively to her locket, clutching it tightly. "I miss you," she said, her voice trembling. "Every moment. But I know you're here, and I'm going to make sure your sacrifice wasn't in vain." As if in response, a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the faintest whisper of pine needles and wildflowers. Zara smiled through her tears, her heart full with the certainty that she was not alone. The days turned into weeks, and Zara began to rebuild her life with quiet determination. The cabin became more than a refuge. It was a place where she could create something lasting, something that honored the love she and Ethan had shared. She took long walks through the forest with Rex, exploring its hidden corners and rediscovering the landmarks from the map. Each step felt like a bridge between the past and present, a way to carry forward the lessons and love that had shaped her. One afternoon, she returned to the cabin carrying an armful of wildflowers she had gathered from a nearby meadow. She arranged them in a vase, placing it on the small table near the window. The flowers brightened the room, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the earthy tones of the cabin. Zara stepped back, her hands on her hips, and smiled. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She spent her evenings writing in a journal she had found tucked away on the bookshelf. The pages were slowly filling with thoughts, memories, and reflections on the journey she and Ethan had taken. It was her way of preserving their story, ensuring it would not be forgotten, even as she moved forward. Rex was never far from her side, his presence a constant source of comfort. He seemed to sense when her thoughts grew heavy, nudging her with his nose or resting his head on her lap. "You're my rock," Rex, she said one evening, scratching behind his ears as they sat by the fire. "You've been through everything with us. I don't know what I'd do without you." The dog barked softly, his tail wagging, and Zara laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. It felt good to laugh again, to feel a flicker of joy amidst the ache. She had begun to understand that grief and love were intertwined, that one could not exist without the other. And in that understanding, she found a quiet strength. Months passed, and the cabin began to feel like home. Zara had built a routine, a life that was both simple and fulfilling. She had planted a small garden outside, its rows of herbs and vegetables thriving under her care. The walls of the cabin were now adorned with photographs, snapshots of her walks through the forest, of Rex sprawled in the sunlight, and of the wildflowers that grew in the meadow. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Zara stood on the porch, a mug of tea warming her hands. Rex lay at her feet, his ears twitching as he dozed. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of blooming jasmine. Zara closed her eyes, breathing deeply, and felt a sense of harmony settle over her. She thought of Ethan not with the sharp pain of loss, but with a quiet, steady love that filled her chest. His presence was still with her, woven into the fabric of her life. She could feel it in the way the wind brushed her cheek, in the way the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as though watching over her. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. "I'll keep living. For both of us." And as the first stars appeared in the sky, Zara smiled, the warmth of Ethan's love carrying her forward into the quiet beauty of the present.